as a queer person, it is not like craving bonbons. I don't wake up and go, ooh, I'm feeling real homosexual today. Like, I got to get my fix. And they always say practicing homosexuality, and I just have a quibble with that. Like, from my experience, if you are queer, you don't need to practice. Like, I'm good at it. I don't need practice.
Welcome to My Brother, My Brother's Friend and Me, a podcast where two ex-evangelical siblings and an ex-Catholic non-sibling review Christian media and either praise or condemn it. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Michael.
And Josh isn't here today because we're doing a bonus episode about the Hulu documentary, aka Jane Roe. Michael, do you want to give us a quick rundown of this documentary before we get into what you described as, quote, a novel's worth of notes?
Yeah, so this is a documentary about the famous, probably the most famous wedge issue of our contemporary politics, Roe versus Wade, which basically said that states did not have the option to limit abortion within the first trimester and limited what they could do otherwise. And of course, like, there's more to the decision, but basically the Supreme Court decided this important case. And this is all about the woman at the forefront of this, who, her name is not Jane Roe. Her name is Norma McCorvey. I always end up pronouncing her last name wrong. So yeah, I call her Norma most often in my notes, just because that's her actual name. But this documentary was a wild ride.
It was so much. I mean, from the jump, they have a shot of her, and they have her like putting on like an oxygen tube basically, and you can tell like she doesn't look. I mean, she looks miserable. Like she's like in a nursing home. You can tell that her eyebrows are drawn on. I mean, she doesn't look like she's like feeling well. Certainly, the opening shot is her talking about like her fleas acting up, which is a wild thing, and then like. She's like, yeah, this is my deathbed confession. Basically, she's like, no, this is me getting out all my skeletons in my closet. It's incredible.
I thought it was a powerful opening to just like literally start with, "This is my deathbed confession."
Yeah, exactly.
Just because it sets up what this is all about, right? And I do like that. You know, the very first thing they do is give us like a little SparkNotes moment of what Roe is, kind of what we did just now, just in case anyone has been asleep or not from the U.S. Because I think those are the only ways you don't know about Roe v. Wade. This documentary goes in twists and turns, and most of what I wrote are about plot summary, but I have a lot of the movement and what attracted me to this documentary for us to review it, even though it's kind of outside of our normal purview, is I feel like it's the perfect intersection of, in particular, evangelicals, but like the religious right in general, weaponizing and like kind of infiltrating culture in a like really toxic way. Mm-hmm. And I really think that is, at the end of the day, what this documentary is about.
There's a lot of like, I did appreciate the way that they like ran down like, hey, this is who Norma McCorvey was, and like this is how her life went, because for at least I can't talk about you, but like for me, like I didn't know anything about who Norma McCorvey was until I watched this documentary. Besides the fact that she was, I mean, I didn't know her real name. I just know that she was like the eponymous, I think that's how you say that, Roe in Roe v. Wade, and like that's the reason that we have abortions now in the United States. So I appreciated them giving us that quick summary of like what the case was and what it was. But then the documentary goes like further back, and it sort of like pulls the camera back and says like, but this is what her life was like. This is how she ended up in this court case. And like what I learned from this documentary is that like she doesn't have a great life. Like she is a person who has suffered a great deal. To be put in the place that she was at the center of this court case. And I think the documentary makes a very good example, or makes a pretty good case for the fact that like Norma McCorvey through her whole life was kind of like used by everyone, used by the lawyers who, wanted to bring the case up to the Supreme Court, used by the evangelical movement to try to force this, this abortion advocate to become their pawn, basically. And we see how Norma throughout this entire case is just that, a pawn being used by all sides to try to get what they want out of this court case, and it's really, really upsetting.
It is, and I can't get out of my head I can't remember the woman's name, but she was an abortion counselor, and she
I just
was
have her as
heavily
abortion
interviewed.
counselor, yeah.
Yeah, what she said about Norma and about how the abuse that she suffered and the childhood that she suffered has kind of led to an adulthood where everything is framed in a victim lens, as not so much as a, like, I want to be careful here, because even how she said it was not a pointing a finger, it was as a self-preservation thing, right? If it's me against the world and like I'm always fighting and my triumphs are bigger and my defeats don't feel as awful. And Norma had a lot stacked against her. So I think it's a very like reasonable step.
Yeah, you can definitely see, because the way that the abortion counselor frames it is she's like, yeah, like she has this victim mentality, which is kind of a cruel way to frame it. But like she is somebody who has just constantly been kicked while she was down throughout her entire life. And that's sort of why you see that she ends up the way that she is. She's somebody who, like the main example that I took away was they're talking about her first kid, I believe, and how like when her first kid was like basically taken away from her. Norma said like, well, it was because my mom thought that I was a lesbian, and like she told the courts that that she couldn't take care of her kid. And what the abortion counselor was saying is like, well, I mean, she kind of couldn't take care of her kid, but the way that Norma framed it was so that it seemed like her parents were the ones, her mom was the one that was separating her from her child against her will. And like the doc doesn't really go into whether or not that's true. It doesn't really like take one side or the other, like her mom's side or McCorvey's side. It just says like, yeah, this is why, she feels this way, is because of all these terrible things that have happened to her. It's a tough watch. It really is.
And I think like the documentary not taking a side is probably the best of a bad option, right? Like I don't think there was a good option here.
Yeah.
Because from my reading, like there is no real clear answer. It's very complicated. Even if you can like read all the records, you don't get closer to an answer here.
Yeah. I mean, if you are like hurt by your parents, like you don't make up lies about that. Like that's the thing people don't lie about, and that's where we get McCorvey's whole animosity towards her mom.
Yeah, and like just the history of abuse, and she said a quote in the video that I felt like was so telling about her and like really explained her character as a person and just also her character as a public persona. If you're nice, polite, and quiet, no one will pay you attention. I like attention.
Yeah, I definitely caught on to that. Like her whole thing is like being somebody. She wanted to be an actress, is what she said at the beginning. Yeah. Like that's her whole thing.
Well, and she goes into a lot of abuse from her parents. Her mom was an alcoholic. Her dad left the family. When she was very young, she ran away with another girl. They were found in a hotel room. And then like the cops were called on them. It was just this, I feel like Norma's life has been like one case of an adult escalating a situation that just shouldn't have been escalated. And I mean, no wonder. I had to laugh about how she talked about reform school. So as a queer person myself, something I have always kind of gotten a little out is let's send a bunch of kids showing same-sex attraction to an all same-sex school.
That'll fix it.
That'll fix it.
I think the quote from the documentary is, "I never saw so many boobs in my life."
Yes. And it was interesting to hear Norma talk about that because this is something. So I am a true crime like fanatic, and one of my favorite cases is, I don't know if you're familiar with the Dee Dee and Gypsy Rose Blanchard case.
Oh no.
This will be a later conversation, but basically it's a Munchausen by proxy case.
Oh, okay. I feel like Sierra has probably watched a documentary about
Yes.
that.
So basically, in prison, Gypsy Rose had an interview in which she said, even though I'm in prison, I've never felt more free. And hearing Norma talk about how she was in reform school was kind of a similar thing, right? Like when you're in a like place of an authoritarian, abusive household, even if you're going to be in a reform school or prison or somewhere that is not free whatsoever, you might feel free.
It's definitely a different framing. Like the way that McCorvey talks about it. She's like, yeah, like I've never. She had tons of girlfriends, and like she was able to, you know, kind of explore like more of who she was. Like I feel like the structure of that school, as opposed to like being away from her, you know, abusive mom, like gave her something that otherwise she wouldn't have had access to. And like you said, yeah, like when people are taken away from their households and put into a place where they can actually sort of be who they are, it's a weird thing, right? Because when people reform in prison, right? Like that's, I mean, it's not great, right? Because prisons are bad, obviously, but
Obviously, yes.
despite the fact that you're in, like what you're saying, like a situation that is bad and miserable, you are still given resources that, because of your situation, because of your poverty, because of your class, like you wouldn't have otherwise had access to. And that's, I mean, such a weird and bad thing about America is that we can put you in a jail and you'll be more free, like you said,
Yeah,
than
and
you've
like
ever been.
it's a bleak thought, but I think it is one that is like very true of abusive households. And whether, you know, it's Munchausen by proxy, an alcoholic parent that literally slaps you, like there are similar here, right? And you know, things don't go much better for Norma when she gets out of school. Because after reform school, she was sent to live with her relative who sexually assaulted her.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it sucks. There's no getting around it. It's a terrible thing that happened to a person.
And, you know, it just really reminds me, like, you know, a lot of times we only have the choices that we're given, and Norma was just not given the tools to make what we would consider good choices in heavy quotation marks. She grew up and her role model was an abusive alcoholic. She didn't spend her entire childhood there. She went to a reform school, left that school where she was able to explore her sexuality and kind of like get more in touch with her, only to be sexually used by a relative that she was living with. And, you know, things just don't end up going much better for her because she ends up getting pregnant and decides to have an abortion because she alludes to the fact that she's homeless for all intents and purposes, right? Like she never says I was homeless, but she said I was on the streets. And, you know, this is someone who didn't have the means to really do anything about that. So she decided to go and get an abortion in Dallas. And I mean, it's just chilling where, quote, a lot of women didn't make it out.
Yeah, I mean they describe this underground abortion doc. Well, first they describe what happens with this first abortion doctor who I mean she said that she was sexually assaulted and that's what resulted in her pregnancy. And what he tells her, he's like, oh, well, was the rapist black? And like, so cool start. And then like she has a look around this place and this very not sanitary, like she said it was crawling with like cockroaches and stuff, and like you said, like people did not make it out. And she's like, well, I'm gonna leave or I will die here. And she does leave, to her credit. I mean, that's that's the whole crux of the issue of why we have this discussion about Roe versus Wade, is because right, if people are trying to have abortions, they're gonna try to do it either through underground means or through the use of sketchy physicians, and they'll often die in the process. And like that's why that's why we have this whole fight about abortion being safe, legal, and rare. Is because for a long time in the United States it wasn't, and the bodies just piled up.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I will say that the pro-choice activist interviewed at the doc do a good job of explaining is like, this is exactly why they wanted a case like Norma's, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I have a lot of thoughts and opinions about, using someone who is impoverished, cannot afford, and preying upon someone who is poor, right? Mm-hmm. There is a reason they were looking for that case, and it was, making abortions illegal does not end them. Mm-hmm. But there are real humans attached to that, right? And Norma is told there are these two attorneys fresh out of law school, and they want a case like yours. And I think what's really troubling about this, and, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but she never got to make her choice about whether or not to carry her pregnancy to term. They got the case, they went to the Supreme Court. And it's just a reminder of like, Norma was used, right? Like, she didn't directly benefit from this. And she even said, right, like, this isn't for me, this is for the people who come after me. And that's jumping ahead a little bit, but I just think that's such an important part of this documentary, and such an important part of Norma's story, is that she even understood what was happening here in a really like clear way.
Oh yeah, because when Coffey and Weddington call her in 1973 and they're like, "Hey, congrats, Norma, we won the case," and McCorvey's like, "No, you won the case. Like, I don't give a shit. Like, I have a baby now because it took 3 years, and like the whole point of the Roe versus Wade argument, Supreme Court decisions don't happen in 9 months, so like it's a moot point now." Like, it's truly tragic, and like the fact that she was well aware she was being used the whole time just makes it even more cutting.
Well, and it's complicated, right? Because she actually never testified in court during all of this. Mm-hmm. And I think there is an argument for like protecting her identity, because we do see what happens when later on in the documentary, when she does decide to come forward. We'll get to that. So I understand like the whole keeping her private, but like, I don't know. I think this is a prime situation of like getting lost in the humanity of a situation for the cause. And it's really complicated.
Yeah, I mean that's the whole thing, right? Like it is kind of it's a tough situation, right? And I don't know if I was in the place of Coffey and Weddington, I think those are the names, yeah. Like that I would be able to, make that call, right? Because they sacrificed their client, like they, for whatever, whatever argument you want to make. McCorvey did not get the results she wanted when she sued in that case. But at the same time, right, we have abortion in the United States now because of that play, right? It was kind of a craven thing to do, to take one woman and basically sacrifice her, but it resulted in decades of legal and safe healthcare for untold thousands of women in the United States. It is a situation where you have to, it's gross to say like weigh the pros and the cons, but in a lot of ways that is what we're doing. We're saying, well, we had to give up one woman to make room for thousands. It's just very, messy, very complicated.
Right? Like there is no right answer, and like I kind of left saying I don't know what decision I would make if I were in any of these people's shoes, so I can't in good faith, cast judgment on it, other than just say, this is very messy.
Absolutely. And speaking of messy situations, so after the case is decided, we are then the documentary introduces us to a man named Flip Benham, I believe is his name. They start this segment out by showing him and the documentary filmers like driving to this abortion clinic in his van, and he starts out by saying, "I'm not an activist. I'm a Christian." And he says, "If you say abortion is murder, you need to act like it is murder." And then we follow him. He calls he calls the clinic an abortion mill, and he's like, "This is where they kill babies all the time." And then he pulls out a poster of two children. One is a black baby, and he's like, "Well, this is he has a name for it." And he's like, "This is this baby.
Isn't it like
he survived
Malachi or something? It's something biblical."
Yeah, something biblical. Yeah, he's like, "This is Malachi or some shit," and he survived. And then he's like, "This is like another biblical name," and they're dead. And it's like, it looks like it's like a doll. Honestly, it looks like pieces of a doll or some shit, because it's there's a lot of emphasis on fetal remains in this documentary, which is super weird. But like, he's like, "Yeah, no, this is this is what fetal remains look like," and it's like, I don't think that's true, sir, but I don't know. It's so weird. But like, this guy Flip Benham, he's this I guess he's a pastor, kind of like very evangelical type, like very gung ho. Like and the documentary talks about him and like his time working as an anti-abortion activist. He says like in the beginning he was all like anti-abortion, and like he would like go to rallies and beg to be arrested by the cops because he's a weird dude. And like they showed montages of like him and Operation Rescue is what they called his operation to cut down on abortions. And they would show like clips of him and like other Christians like crawling on their hands and knees towards the clinic and like crying, and like at one point they show him like getting up on a ladder and like yelling over into the abortion clinic, like over the fence. And there is one funny bit, because like he's talking, he's like, "You do all you can do to try and not give moms a chance," and like the people on the other side of the fence, the abortion workers, are like, "That's right,
yeah,
thank you." "Thank you, I'll do that." And they're like holding up soundproofing like panels and shit. It's really
It is funny to see the one worker at the clinic literally shake her head and start laughing when he comes by, because there is absurdism in the like anti-choice protesters, and I think Flip is the perfect example of that. He is an absurd human being.
Yeah, he's a real weirdo. But I mean, I think he is also emblematic of the people, I'm sure you've met these people, Michael, that are like incredibly anti-abortion, like to the point of fanaticism, to the point where like it's their whole identity. They don't exist without the anti-abortion cause. And Flip is definitely that person. Like he has this terrible martyr complex. He like that you see throughout the film. He's just like, "Oh, please arrest us, please, chief. We want to be arrested." And like his whole thing is like how badly he wants to save all the babies. And it's like, I think you're missing the point.
Yeah, I mean,
my good dude.
There's some obvious lost plot amongst the anti-choice movement, and I feel like language is important. I refuse to call it movement as long as the protesters are threatening bomb threats, death threats, and willing to trade the lives of pregnant people for fetuses. And that is what argument they're making. So for me, it's anti-choice. It has nothing to do with life, because if you're calling an abortion clinic saying you're murdering a bunch of babies, I'm going to blow you up. Congratulations, you've stooped to the same level you're claiming to fight.
Yeah, you sort of lost the high ground there. There's so much to talk about with the anti-choice movement. Like, gosh, there's we'll get to them. So the documentary cuts to Reverend Robert Schenck, I believe is how you pronounce it. And so this guy is a priest of some sort. I don't know if he I think he's like an evangelical, but like not so much anymore. And the first clip they show of him is like him talking about all his anti-abortion work, and he like immediately starts like there's a clip of a protester, and she's like not wearing a lot of clothes, like basically she has like tape over her breasts, and like he immediately starts talking about her how she has more worth than her boobs. I was like, okay, so this is another piece of shit dude. And this guy's character arc is very interesting, I think, as far as this documentary frames it. So he's also a part of Operation Rescue. This is another thing, like they get fetal remains and like cart them around and like, hey, look, this is a dead baby or whatever. And he talks about how this makes him feel morally vindicated. And like the whole thing had just this extremely performative air. It's like pretty gross, but like it's definitely that thing that we were talking about how the whole pro life movement is like only about 50% like actually caring about fetal remains, and like the other half is just like, I'm a saint.
Yes. Are you ready for a tie-in that I feel like I have to interject here?
Oh boy, I'm scared now.
So, Schenck was involved in, let me just make sure I'm getting this correct. So he was involved in the Houston sermon subpoena from 2014, the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance. That we mentioned in our God's Not Dead recording.
From God's Not Dead, yeah. Oh my god, this guy was involved in it?
Uh-huh.
Holy shit.
Yep, he was one of the ones subpoenaed.
It all comes back to God's Not Dead.
Yep, it all comes back. But he was the one that talked to the mayor, and like the subpoenas for him were actually retracted.
Okay.
But
so
that's your tie-in.
That's crazy. Oh man. What a small world the pro-life movement is.
Oh, it is.
So the documentary continues. And we learn through the course of the documentary that so Norma McCorvey,
we actually go back a little bit to Norma's childhood and like young adulthood, which I think has some important threads. When she was working and got picked up by a man much older than her.
Oh yeah, this is where she marries this man who is 22 when she is 16.
Yes.
And he's just like a huge piece of shit. But her mom was like, yeah, why don't you just marry him since you're having sex with him? And like she was like, well, okay. So that's fucked up.
Yeah, and I mean it also, we get to talk about Norma's long-term relationship with Connie. She starts a long-term relationship with a woman named Connie because she was caught shoplifting. And there's a lot of sad in this story, but seeing the two of them talk about like how they met is really heartwarming, and there's a lot of love between these two.
It's a very cute story. Like it's genuinely like adorable, watching them interact and like talk to each other, and like you can tell they're like definitely just like an old couple that loves each other. It's really kind of nice to see.
I mean, it really is very, very cute. And I do like how this documentary kind of like flashes forward to a piece of Roe and kind of ties the two, because next we get to see Norma before she comes out as a pro-life activist. She actually comes out as a pro-choice activist. And she admits that I, Norma, am Jane Roe. And she looked at the entire like situation with the violence against abortion clinics and all of that, and that's what inspired her to come forward. Um, and then, the counselor, she's full of these memorable little, like, insightful moments, where she said, "It was then I realized being friends with Norma was a complicated experience." I think, like, that is probably the most succinct way to put how being friends with Norma is, right? Like, even her meet cute with her long-term partner was, "I was shoplifting in your store."
Yeah, I was trying to rob you.
So Norma actually goes on the speaking circuit and talks to a lot of media. And here's something that is just a common thread in Norma's story. She's very comfortable speaking to the media and, like, telling her story. And I don't know how well this actually serves her, to be completely honest. I think it lets her kind of become an avatar for either movement without herself, like, being in control of that. And because of the sensationalizing of the story, like, the media is not going to say no. And I think they'd be bad at their job if they did. But she admits and says that she was not raped with her pregnancy with the daughter she gave up for adoption. And this gets complicated, right? Because she went to the doctor, and this was not a time where you could just, like, walk in and say, "I want one, I'm going to get one." And frankly, in a lot of states, you still can't do that. But yeah, I read quite a while ago, I don't know if it's still true, but in Japan, for example, there's no such thing as, like, a no excuse abortion in any, like, phase. So what happens is, if you go to the doctor and say, "I want to get one," and you don't have a quote unquote reason on there, like medical or like rape or incest, they will put stress from financial insecurity. And so even, like, wealthier people will say, like, "Oh, I already have a kid," or, "I can't afford one," or "I live in a one bedroom," whatever it may be. And so it's just like a reminder that these restrictive laws just kind of put everyone in a position of truth isn't an option. And I do wonder how much of Norma's story was truth was not an option for her, right? But of course, this then upsets the pro-choice movement, because even though none of Roe v. Wade was about whether or not Norma was raped, you get to run a headline that Jane Roe admits she wasn't raped, and then the right wing gets to run with this story, which they do, and they shoot up her house, her car. And so I'll be honest, I was familiar with Norma and the story of Jane Roe because she is often used in at least evangelical communities, I can speak to my own, as a shining example of, like, a Paul-esque figure of you're never too fallen from grace to get redemption. She's used a lot in quote-unquote ex-gay, like, really abusive conversion therapy, as an example of, hey, look, she still maintained a platonic relationship and, like, was saved by the grace of God, and now she's straight. So I was familiar with that, and I always thought that shift was because of things like this, of my home's being shot up, I'm unsafe. And it's because, like, you really do get the sense that, like, the anti-choice movement is very comfortable doing things like this.
Extremely comfortable, yeah. I mean, there are countless examples of violence being enacted against, quote-unquote liberal or, radical sects that are, against Christianity, like their Christian beliefs, right? The whole point of this documentary, or what am I trying to say? The whole point of this is to say, like, yeah, like, we are willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that, abortions don't happen, because we believe abortion is murder, and therefore if you are doing murder, we have to treat it like it's murder. We have to do everything we can do to stop it. And that's where we get this incredible violence against abortion clinics and practitioners of abortion. I mean, like they say, like they compare Roe versus Wade to the Holocaust, which is an incredibly common tactic among the anti-choice movement, and you know it continues to this day. Plenty of people will tell you that like tens of millions of babies are killed. Like there's a new Holocaust every year because of abortion. That's just how the framing works, unfortunately.
It's like when I see these this rhetoric happening in like the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I'm like, oh, the more things change, right? Like the more they're just the same. Um, I do like that we get to the March on Washington. We get to see her attorney, who is Gloria Allred. In this house, we stand Gloria Allred. She's great. I love her. I was very happy to see her. You know, Norma was often accused of like capitalizing on her fame, and something that Gloria Allred really does is like push back against those arguments with her cases, and incidentally does so in a way that gets a lot of attention.
Yeah.
But she shows like this woman had her house shot, and you're telling me that she's capitalizing on her fame? Come on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's like a whole section where her attorney's like, yeah, no, I don't think she's capitalizing on shit because like, look, all her belongings have been shot up. Like this isn't a play for attention or power or fame. This is just somebody like speaking what they believe. And like, how dare you even try to compare this to that when she's in mortal danger? Like, get fucked.
Yes.
Come on.
And this, I feel, is where the documentary goes from dark to...
Yeah, it gets rough here.
So everyone should buckle up.
Yeah, because we're gonna go back to our friend Flip. And what happens with Flip is that they figure out where Norma is at this point working at like some sort of abortion clinic, or like it's some sort of like pro-choice like office basically, and Operation Rescue finds out where that office is, and they purchase the building next to it, and they're like, we live here now, and we're gonna be your neighbors, and like that's, oh god. I'm sure this has happened in places you've lived, Michael, but basically in every city that I've lived, there is a women's health center, which is a big pink fucking ugly looking building, right next to an abortion clinic, and like basically it's all the time. It's like it's a very manipulative, disgusting tactic that you know, anti-choice activists do, which is like they take something and they're like, oh, we're going to trick people. I mean, they're very upfront about that. They're like, oh, we're just going to trick people and tell them that like you can get an abortion here. And then when a pregnant person comes in, they're like, oh, yeah, sorry about that, but do you want a pamphlet instead?
Right. And so I'm actually going to put a link with this. So Samantha Bee, the late night, did an amazing segment about women's health centers, you know, and how duplicitous they are and how misleading they are, and how oftentimes, due to states restricting access to abortion, these places will remain open even as abortion clinics close. So a lot of people will go to this clinic expecting, hey, I have a choice to make here. They're going to help me shepherd to a place to where I make the best choice for me. And then actually you go in and there is no choice. It's about indoctrination and like guilt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those places are fucking gross.
Yeah.
It sucks really bad. Let's see. I mean, like, when Norma finds out that the Operation Rescue is doing this, she at first does not take it well, understandably so. You know, there's a lot of she's Flip says that like the first time that they talked, like she would like call their office and be like, hey, we're having barbecued babies for lunch, which I thought was pretty funny and insightful into her personality. And like, you know, they're very adversarial for a long time. And then the story takes a turn, And at one point, Flip gets Norma to open up to him, and it's like, he's like, this is there's just one day where like she opened up to me, and she was like, what do you want me to do, Flip? And then Flip was like, oh, this is the first time I've actually been able to have a dialogue with her. And then he has her sit down on a bench next to him, and he says, quote, "Do you like what you're doing?" And that's the fulcrum at which like this whole narrative takes a turn, because this is the point where eventually Flip and Norma get to talking, and eventually Flip converts Norma into being a born again Christian. Right? Apparently there was a huge sticking point for the movement, specifically the anti-choice movement. Yes, because like they were like, oh great, we flipped Jane Roe, like now now she's on our side, and she becomes this like she was for the pro-choice movement. Now she's an anti-choice like advocate, and it's a huge deal, and it does huge damage to the pro-choice movement.
I have a lot to break down with this scene. This is where I started writing a novel. So yeah. I think I want to start macro and then get micro. So the macro is the pro-life or anti-choice movement decided, probably tactful, like in a really like intelligent and evil choice, that they were going to let Norma speak. And something that the pro-choice movement has never really been afforded in history is a place of moral high ground. And, that's mentioned in the documentary. And so for them, it's all about, and like, as someone who is very, very pro-choice, it's always about like, who is our best messenger? How can we like wrap this in a way that people who maybe aren't like fired up about it on either side, but maybe are like leaning in favor, how do we wrap this in a way that we can get that person to be fired up about this? And it's hard. It's really threading a tiny needle. Whereas the anti-choice movement, they just got to be loud. Because the people who feel the way that they feel about it feel so strongly because, I've said it before in this podcast, when eternity is at stake, nothing is off the table. No behavior is too bad. No earthly action is damnable when you're literally in your mind saving people for eternity. And because of that, they really do give Norma like the biggest megaphone and roll her out. And it feels like the direct inverse, where the pro-choice community was like, hey, like, love you, mean it, we appreciate you, but could you be quiet? The anti-choice movement was like, we want you out there every day, just saying all of the things you say to us, but loud. And it really is this like creeping evil. Like the longer I think about it, the more sick it seems, because you're preying on someone who was abused and who was looking for affirmation.
It is an incredibly insidious and manipulative tactic that the pro choice movement uses, right? Evangelicalism and Christianity in general has no problem targeting people who are weak, or not necessarily weak, but have been manipulated, have had a life in which they do not have a support structure, and they see those people and they say, we can turn them into a weapon. And they do it because, like you said, nothing is off the table when eternity is at stake. It is something that you just do because to do otherwise is to commit a sin, or to miss an opportunity to evangelize, which is on par with a sin. And they're, yeah, like you said, right? The pro-choice movement missed, in some ways, an opportunity to fire up their base, right? With Norm, they could have had her out there, being a big activist, a big speaker, where she turned out to not actually, be able to energize them, specifically because of that gaffe with the saying that she wasn't actually assaulted, right? That really turned a lot of people off for her. So, the pro-choice movement was like, no, we're actually done with you. There's just we get into these montages of Norma being carted out as this paragon for the anti-choice movement, right? We see they describe her as their Oscar, right? Like because she's such a phenomenal actress. They describe, they're like, oh no, there's no trophy for us, even though it's very clear how badly they wanted to pursue Norma. There's one scene where they hold this memorial service for the unborn child, and at that point I was like, y'all, like anti-choice people are so fucking corny, it's ridiculous. Have you seen those things that go around on Facebook where it's like Tomb of the Unborn Soldier?
Yeah. I mean, look, not only have I seen it on Facebook, like I feel like I narrowly missed being swept into this because the churches I attended as a child were very much this way. And I have this very distinct memory of I've got to be no older than like 6 or 7. And our youth group and Sunday school were planning an after-church protest at an abortion clinic. And they were like, we want each and every one of you to go ask your parents if you can go and just stay after church and go. And like, they didn't really tell us. They said, we're going to a protest. They didn't say what, anything like that. And I remember me being like, little baby activist. I love people. I've always been a gregarious person. I'm like, give me a crowd. Let's go. I remember going to my mom and asking, and she's like, what is this? And so she asked the Sunday school teacher, and they're like, oh yeah, we're going to go to an abortion clinic. And my mom goes, you will never invite one of my children to that again. I think what you're doing is disgusting, and I don't want to hear any more of it. And said that in front of me. And it's one of my most...
Your mom owns.
Yeah. My mom is one of the big reasons I'm such a militant feminist, because she would never describe herself as that way, but she walked the walk. And I remember afterwards getting in the car with her, and I'm like, why can't we go? I literally had no idea still what this was. And she goes, look, I disagree with what they're doing at the protest. I don't think the way they're going about it is right. And they are... Hold on one second. My cat just jumped on the stove and it's on. But yeah, I do feel like I narrowly missed that due only because of my mother. And I always think of that when kids are there. I'm like, it's like when the fucking March for Life happens in DC.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
I always get so annoyed when I see the children there, and then I keep thinking to myself, they didn't have an advocate like my brother and I did in our mom.
No. So the March for Life occupies a very weird place in my life because when I went to my Catholic high school, the March for Life was a thing that was an annual thing, right? That they offered, like, basically you could like get out of class for like several days if you told your teachers like, hey, I'm going to the March for Life. So like there would always be like maybe, I don't know, for like 30 kids at my high school that would go to the March for Life and like put on a big protest. And I just it was always so strange to me just like seeing those kids go and like, I don't know, there's a part of me that was like, I mean, I kind of want to go, I think, because like, I mean, that's a good thing, right? Abortion bad, right? But at the same time, just like seeing people show up with signs, and like, it is that aspect of being performative, right? The whole facade, the whole dance of the March for Life is showing up in Washington, getting offended by stuff, and then like getting out of school for it and being like, I did a good thing today. And it always skeeved me out at the same time as being something that I kind of wanted to participate in until like, I guess, March of 2013, when I was like, I think Catholicism's bullshit now. That's not great.
It's
oh well.
It's really interesting because I do feel like a lot of people who grew up in like more conservative strains of Christianity, I feel like all of us kind of went through a like pro-life, anti-choice phase. And I do always find it interesting, like where it tracks, if someone is still religious, if they're still in it or not, and vice versa. I do think like it's a universal experience because it is one of the easiest things to get people mobilized, get people involved. And in my not so fun fact, we'll talk about how that is not an accident.
Nope.
I do want to talk about very quickly a very small scene that like choked me up a little. I'm not a very like sensitive person. I don't really cry during movies or TV shows. I don't get in my feelings very often. But seeing Connie's face at Norma's baptism broke me.
That portion was probably the hardest part of the doc for me to watch, because when Connie realizes like that this flip that Norma experiences, where she starts to, you know, become this born again Christian, become this person who, you know, it has, quote, turned over a new leaf. And like Flip is talking about how homosexuality destroys nations, and because she went over to the anti-choice side, you know, they have to break up now. It's devastating, and it's really sad. It is a genuine tragedy what happens to the relationship, because as the doc describes, they do break up. And Connie is talking about, you know, how much she loved Norma, and Norma says that she loved Connie with all her heart, and Connie dies. She has a stroke and dies eventually. Not because of the stroke, but I mean not because of the stroke, but she does pass away because of, almost certainly because this event had a bad influence on her health. And it is the most frustrating thing to see when a church says, you know, we don't want homosexuals here, we can't condone homosexual practices, and because of that, this relationship that has existed for over 20 years no longer exists. It is disgusting and so heartbreaking to have to see. This is one of the very insidious ways that religion sort of gets at you as a person, and makes you question everything that you cared about, and it is just so sad.
Well, and it's an isolation tactic, right? Like they're trying to like break up the bad influences on her, right? So like Connie being a lesbian who's in Norma's life while she was a pro-choice activist, they wanted to like rend that a little bit and like tear that apart. And what I find fascinating, and I do think like this is something we'll never have an answer for because both of these women are dead, did the relationship actually continue afterwards? Because they lived together for 10 years after all of this.
Yeah.
So, I mean, look, I fully understand that people can be enlightened. I don't know that I could live with an ex-gay ex for 10 years.
Yeah, that'd be rough. That's no
for
good.
A decade.
For 10 years, yo, like.
So I do wonder how much of it was performative, and like, there's so much hurt there. So I don't think it matters, right? Because either way, there's so much hurt caused to both Connie and Norma. But I think Connie is such a victim in all of this by nature of just who she ended up falling in love with. And that's a shame.
I mean, it really is. Connie, I feel, is the most sympathetic person in this documentary because, like, through no fault of her own, she gets caught up in this other person. And I can't claim to be an expert on, you know, love and romantic things, but, like, when you do care for someone, you will do stupid shit for them. And, like, that's what happened to Connie. She was like, well, I mean, I care about Norma, and I'll do what it takes to be with her. And unfortunately, that's what ended up, you know, breaking her heart and killing her.
I mean,
like,
You know, I read a psychological study recently that shows like your brain patterns are different when you're assessing a like partner or significant other versus like a stranger or even a friend or a family member. And it's why we're just so willing to put up with things from people like closest to us, because like our brains go, well, I've got to explain this away because they mean so much to me. And I think it's a defense mechanism. I think it's so sad. The look on her face when Norma's getting baptized, and by Flip no less. Flip is a fuck. I hate him.
Yeah, I texted you last night about my feelings on Flip. I often use the phrase, the X person should get their house burned down, when I want to describe something terrible happening to a person, which is, I don't know, it's less and less a joke and as time goes on, and more just like, I think that person should probably actually have their house burned down. For legal reasons, this is a joke, but that man is a monster, and we'll get, at the very end of the doc, we'll get to his final fate, but that person, yeah, bad dude.
Yeah. So we get more of Norma joining the anti-choice movement. We get a rare instance of Gloria Allred being completely speechless about it. And, I mean, imagining... So this doc has, like, an explosive end, and if any of you have, read anything about it, you probably know. I want to keep it to the end. But if you're someone who's kind of following along, it really is hard to swallow and believe that a radical pro-choice queer woman is going to just do a complete 180 and suddenly become like a fundamentalist Catholic anti-choice crusader.
I was confused. I was like, wait, you cannot be born again and also Catholic. That's not allowed. But whatever, sure.
You know, I'm just going to let him have it. It does kind of like, in retrospect especially, show kind of the cracks in the story of like 20 plus years of like lying and like spinning a false story. You're gonna have inconsistencies, and one of them is being baptized in your backyard and also saying you're Catholic. Like,
yeah, that shit is not compatible.
No, I mean, it's kind of the whole fucking point, right? Like,
yeah,
as
exactly.
Someone who was raised in a Baptist church, like, the whole point is adult baptism.
Yeah, no. From the Catholic standpoint, you do that once. Anything else is heresy. So.
I've been baptized twice.
Yeah, well, you're a fucking heretic, Michael. So I don't know why I'm even talking to you.
You know, I'm loads of fun. That's why.
That's why. You're right. So here's the thing. We do learn that she has this history with the anti-choice movement. We learn that she does a lot of these things with the anti-choice movement. She's their mouthpiece. She's their number one champion. We do see a part where where Flip is talking about how he is how he hates Muslims in 2006, and how he burned the Quran, and Nora was there with him burning the Quran. And like at this point I was like, oh, this has taken a turn for the worse. And like it was really at this point where my sympathy for her evaporated. I was just like, oh, we can't do this. We can't. This isn't allowed.
I struggled a lot with Norma just because I have so much sympathy to a person who had no good choices in their life. And like the life that she lived gave her no choices. But then when presented with choices, constantly making the one that is more harmful for the most people is hard for me to just excuse or defend.
Yeah, exactly.
they burn the Quran, they burn the actual document of Roe, they burn a gay pride flag. She's associating with a man that described homosexuality as, craving bonbons.
Yeah, they have a really gross quote about like emergency rooms, and I was like, all right, you can get fucked, dude.
Yeah, and like, okay, a couple of things. As a queer person, it is not like craving bonbons. I don't wake up and go, ooh, I'm feeling real homosexual today. Like, I gotta get my fix. And they always say practicing homosexuality. And I just have a quibble with that. Like, from my experience, if you are queer, you don't need to practice. Like, I'm good at it. I don't need practice. And, like, they constantly use that. Like, the right wing loves to say practicing homosexuals. And I'm like, okay, what if you observe, like, major gay holidays, but, like, aren't all the time? Like, where's the line?
You can skip a monster ball every now and
Yeah,
then.
every now and then, you don't have to go to all the circuit parties, but you should attend Pride. It's just, like, it's really gross, and it's conversations that I've heard my whole life, so I have no patience for them, and I view it as so problematic and damaging that Norma willingly associated with this man.
Mm-hmm. Right,
But
here's the thing.
Do you want to take this, Aaron?
At the end of the documentary, she's like, oh yeah, they paid me off. That was all a fucking lie. And then it's just astonishing the way, because they take these shots, they film the reactions of because they get the footage of her being like, oh yeah, Operation Rescue paid me, this was all a joke, I never actually believed in the anti-choice movement, and then they film the reactions of everyone doing it, from like her friend, the abortion attorney, or like, and like her personal attorney. And then, like, it was really, really hard to watch her personal attorney just, like, basically break down, and she's like, it's just really big stakes, and like, watch how the betrayal shatters her. It's just like, this whole time, this wasn't anything to you, and like, it is so brutal to watch. And then, like, the only sort of bittersweet, like, kind of, gotcha at the end is Flip's reaction, because like Flip kisses the Bible and he's like, we never gave her any money, and then they immediately cut to, okay, so we gave her money, but it's not like you haven't done anything like that either, you're just using people, And it's just like, well, that's pretty par for the course for people like you, Flip, but it is hard to watch.
His
to
reaction
watch.
was so telling.
Yeah, no, because you've met those people where if you catch them in a lie, they'll immediately just be like, no, this is your fault, actually. And it's just brutal to see everybody break down. I thought that Shank had the most, like, genuine reaction, which is like, yeah, we did pay her off, and it's not a morally defensible thing that we did, but we did it because we needed to, and I'm sorry about it.
Yeah.
Like, for what it's worth.
I mean, Shank, at the very least, expresses, he now is someone who's, like, working to undo a lot of the anti-choice movement, and actually is an active voice on how the pro-life movement, the quote-unquote pro-life movement, is silent on gun violence.
Yeah,
weird.
And
that's, like, a shift. I feel like he's someone that, like, understands. However, during his, like, tearful confession, I was like, okay, so, like, they're trying to paint him sympathetic, but I sincerely hope that he's haunted by what he's done for the rest of his days on this planet. I do.
Yeah, I mean, as he should be, right? That's the thing we get to with people who are involved in these movements, right? Is that they can express remorse and sympathy all they want, but forgiveness does not work the same way like it does in the church, right? And you don't just get to pray to God and be like, I'm so sorry, Lord, for what I've done. You have to do the work, right? You have to right? What is that quote from the Bible, right? You'll sow the seeds that you have you have
Yeah.
planted, right? You have to reap
Yeah.
the whirlwind. And
I mean, he really
these
here's the thing, like they have sown the wind, they'll reap the whirlwind. Like it's just what's gonna happen. Like I
and that's the worst thing, Michael, is that I don't know
No.
that it's gonna happen, right? I don't. Right, from all we have seen from the past, I don't know how. You're like basically my age, right? You're 25-ish. Yeah, so you're the same age as me. The past 25 years that we've been on this stupid planet, all we have seen are constant setbacks and just the erosion of rights from, we had a pretty cool time in 2015, and then literally everything else has been dog shit.
Yeah, and I mean here's the thing. Like we are now living in a world where states are able to overturn Roe in everything but name. And
yeah, and this was before Kavanaugh too. Like,
and here's the thing: the anti-choice movement never needs to overturn Roe. They just need to chip away at it enough that it's irrelevant. And I don't know, frankly, if they want to overturn Roe. I think they want a bad guy to go against, and I think Roe makes an easy one.
Right, that's the thing. If they do manage to overturn Roe versus Wade, where do we go from there, right? You always need a Goliath. You always need a Satan. You always need, somebody to point to and be like, that's the bad guy, and we are fighting against him. And when you remove that obstacle, that big evil idol, what happens? And what happens is that you fall to pieces in factionalism, right? We get the 30 Years' War again, right? We've seen what happens when Christians don't have enemies to fight against, and it's that they turn on each other. And, as terrible as it would be to see our world, lose the right to a safe and legal abortion, right? The only consolation would be like, well, at least you guys are fucking coming down with us.
Yeah.
Like,
and I mean, I do think it's interesting, right? Like, we're kind of starting to see some of that, because I do think that there are more and more people becoming like Shank, where they're like, hey, maybe people will just still get abortions and die. And it's like, yeah, it's not like we've all been saying that.
Yeah, dog. Like, please listen for once.
And I find it interesting too that like no one's able to put a dollar amount on how much Norma was paid.
Yeah, but it was apparently a fucking lot.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. And like, I found her funeral scene really sad and disgusting, where Flip was, using the funeral to like preach being anti-choice. And like, I've been to funerals like that. It's just like, there's nothing that feels shittier than like, I want to be comforted right now. I've lost someone important to me in some way. And you're sitting up there talking about like dead babies.
Yeah. The quote that I believe Shank gives this quote, but he says, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? When you do what we did to Norma, you lose your soul. And you can definitely see in the character of Flip a soulless individual, right? He, from the beginning of the time that he spent with Norma McCorvey to literally her funeral, he's talking about how like this is the quietest that she's ever been. It is profoundly disgusting. It is an outrage. It is a travesty. I don't have the words to describe how fucking gross it is to see this guy make a mockery of this person's last celebration.
Yeah. I mean, it gets into a lot of kind of what I want to talk about with this, and it's that, you know, it's funny because this is packaged really as a documentary about Norma, but I do think it is just as much a documentary about the religious right. And I think it's important to note, like, I've talked to you about this, but I don't think I've said this on the podcast. Evangelicals, Protestant evangelicals, were not against Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because that is something I had no fucking idea was a thing.
The Southern Baptist Convention, they actually said, they released a statement when Roe v. Wade was passed, and it was not as negative as you would think. When Roe v. Wade came out, the vast majority of evangelical Christians said nothing about it. To be completely honest, at the time, the religious right was not as activated as they are today. And so they really didn't care about politics. They viewed that like, you know, leave unto Caesar what is Caesar's. They really just viewed themselves as separate from it. However, there is a particular, the Southern Baptist Convention, the biggest evangelical organization in the U.S., ran an op-ed just after Roe and said, quote, religious liberty, human equality, and justice are advanced by the Supreme Court abortion decision.
Sorry? What?
Yeah. Yeah.
What the fuck are you talking about, Michael? I don't...
The Southern Baptist Convention viewed Roe as a good decision against human equality.
I'm crying right now because I'm so, astonished and frustrated by this.
And
how is this possible?
A prominent Southern Baptist, Linda Coffey, you may recognize her as one of the attorneys who argued and represented Roe.
Yeah. She was one of these people.
She was one of these people. She said, the ruling does not relieve each individual of standing firmly behind his or her moral or religious viewpoint about what a person is or when life begins. And the whole argument. So here's the thing. Southern Baptist and like Christianity actually has a long history of saying life begins at birth.
I've literally never heard that, Michael. What the fuck are you talking about?
Yes,
that's not... Life begins at conception. Everyone knows that.
Well, here's the thing. A lot of Christians took the passage in the Bible, I've known you since you took your first breath, to mean that you do not gain a soul until you're born. I broke Aaron, everyone. I've broken Aaron.
I'm so mad. I'm so angry because it's just... This is a narrative that's been fed to me for my whole fucking life. Like, that Southern Baptists are, like Catholics, you know, completely solid in their defense of life beginning at conception, and, you know, making sure that we must protect, you know, the lives of the unborn, which begin immediately. And just to hear that that there was a time in America where, you know, there was a split in Christianity, and it wasn't all fucking nightmare people being like, hey, life actually doesn't begin at conception.
So here's the kicker. It wasn't until 6 years after Roe was decided that the religious right decided to mobilize on this.
That's a long time.
6 years. So the Supreme Court decided it, and basically, like, everyday, like, standard, like, evangelicals were like, no skin off our back. We view that as a Catholic thing. Like, that's their thing.
That's their dumb shit, yeah.
And so what happened is, like, a few very loud extremists decided, in particular, Paul Weyrich, he decided that he was going to weaponize and galvanize the like abortion issue and make it a wedge issue, because he viewed that there were a lot of people that could go and show up and vote for conservative candidates. However, his goal was not overturning Roe. The goal was continuing segregation, and they thought that that was too unpalatable.
Oh, damn it! We can't not be racist for 1 minute!
No, we can't. No, we can't.
I hate this fucking country.
The choice movement owes itself to a pro-segregation movement.
God damn it, Michael. I don't know if I'm genuinely crying or not. I'm so frustrated. God damn them. I hate them so much.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
The entire anti-choice movement is a Trojan horse for a pro-segregation movement. And what they did is they actually marketed really intelligently. So there's this like disgusting, I'll have to send you a couple of videos that like explain this more in depth. It's heartbreaking and angering. And so they made like propaganda films showing like people wandering in fields with a bunch of graves, and then like a bunch of kids dressed in white, supposed to be kids that could have grown up, and make emotional appeals. And the whole purpose was, if we can get people angry about this and then get our candidates to talk about it. And something notable, a Republican nominee for president in 1980 was a pretty pro-choice governor and actually signed a lot of very pro-choice laws, and then was advised by very conservative people to take on the pro-life, anti-choice mantle to galvanize people by name of Ronald Reagan.
Yep!
I don't know if you've heard of him.
Of course it was! Oh, those bastards. I hate them so much. I hate them so much, Mike. Why would they do this?
So they could keep their schools segregated and keep being racist.
I mean, I don't know what else to say except that it's just like craven and disgusting, but like that's to be expected, because what else is the anti-choice movement but a vehicle for political wins, right?
I felt like it was poetic to put this at the end of the podcast, given that at the end of Roe, the documentary we just watched, aka Jane Roe, we had a bombshell. So I was hoping you had never heard of this, and hoping that we would maybe have some listeners who have never heard of this, because this was instrumental in pushing me so far left on this issue, and like kind of where I am now. I was already pro-choice when I found out about this, but I was like what I would call like squeamishly pro-choice. And then I read the Southern Baptist Convention's op-ed.
There's not a lot of coming back from that.
No.
I don't know what to say, Michael. I'm just genuinely shocked.
I mean, it really does, like, kind of, America has this way of always returning to, like, the source. And the source of so many of our ills are this, like, desire of white people to be racist.
The pathological need.
And it comes out even in this movement. And, like, I actually find then this does beg, like, a very interesting, like, conversation here about how, in recent years especially, the anti-choice movement has taken to weaponize black abortions.
Oh, yeah.
And, like, talk about how could, you know, the argument basically relies on how could Democrats say that they're for black people when they promote killing all of these black babies. And it's like, Dude, the only reason you give a fuck about abortion is because of racism. Like,
It is so hypocritical and so on brand.
it's one of those things that's like shocking, but the premise is not surprising.
Yeah, like, you get it. You get why they did this. Like, there's nothing mystifying
No.
about it. It's just like, oh, yeah, pivot to race politics, of course, because this is the United States. What else would we do?
I do find it interesting, though, that they were like, you know, it's less controversial for us to like take a new issue and like spin it than try to sell our racism. And I find that interesting because like I feel like contemporary politics is almost moving in the opposite direction where
Oh, how so?
people are very comfortable leading with that. Like they're very unafraid to lead with like, you know, I think you look no further than Donald Trump and like how he's been so embraced by the evangelical community. Donald Trump doesn't have a history of being an anti-choice leader. You know, as in the immortal words of Norma, I'd like to know how many abortions he paid for and if he could count how many.
Oh, well, I mean, my day's ruined. I don't know about yours, but
Unfortunately, I came into this knowing a lot of this, but I'm angry all over again.
what a country we live in.
What a country.
Oh, well, do you have any other notes about this documentary? I mean, it was definitely not into entertaining, but definitely informative.
Yeah.
I do recommend people watch it if they haven't, like I hadn't, like known the story about Jane Roe.
And even if you know, I feel like there are lots of threads that like are illuminating that like we didn't cover even and that, you know, are fascinating. So I recommend people watch it. I thought it was a great documentary. I thought even though like every media organization I know has run with the story of, you know, the headline, Jane Roe admits to being paid by the pro-life lobby. And even if you know that going in, the shock on everyone's face when they admit that, except for Reverend Shank, I find to be so fascinating.
It is incredibly telling for him to be like, yeah, about that.
Well, he literally said she started to question something, we cut her a check.
Yep. I mean, craven is a word that I throw around a lot these days, but this is an especially egregious example of willingness to just completely abandon your politics for political gain.
I feel like this story and like the story of the pro-choice movement and like the anti-choice movement in America is like a Russian nesting doll of bullshit. Like,
yeah, it just keeps getting
yeah.
deeper and deeper. Oh. I mean, I don't have anything else to add. I'm just very sad now.
I feel like it's almost best to let this breathe, let everyone think about this, because I don't know that there is much more to add.
No, not really. Well, Michael, where can people find you on the internet?
You can find me on Twitter at Michael's Diamonds.
And you can find me on Twitter at AaronSXL. And you can, follow this podcast, however you do that. I'm not sure how we, I don't even remember. I'm still so shell-shocked from this whole conversation that I don't know where I am. I'm, like, physically disoriented.
Yeah, I mean, this one's a tough one to sign off on, guys. Like, I don't know what to leave you with. I don't know. I mean, I feel like it's trite to tell you to follow us, but if you want more heartbreaking revelations like this.
Yeah. Definitely stick around. I guess, yeah, we will see you all on, I guess, Friday, I think, is when our new episode's coming out, and are not coming out when recording it. where we rank the books of the Old Testament from best to worst, which I think is really funny.
It's going to be such a remarkably different vibe.
Yeah, than this, which was just a huge downer through and through. Yeah. Yep. Well, like me today, don't forget that Jesus wept, and we'll see you later.